right. Well, welcome everyone. So, yeah, this mixing from home class. My idea for this class is to help provide a few tips and tricks and ways of using some of the tools we have at our disposal to make better quality mixes from home. And what that sort of means is that as I look around the screens, a lot of us aren't in ideal scenarios for, studio um, with amazing speakers and like out of these magazines that, a lot of people have the opportunity to work in, and most of the time nowadays we don't. And so there's been a few things that I've been doing through the years that have helped achieve results. Um, I guess that sort of up the game when my monitoring systems aren't great or when my room itself isn't necessarily great, like some ways of incorporating a bunch of different pieces that kind of help. And we're going to cover some of that today, sort of some ways of kind of, doing some things that kind of can help us achieve better results. Then we're going to talk about EQ and some tips and tricks on EQ, some ways of thinking of EQ, and the way that I use EQ, and some sort of the way I boiled that down is some common EQ areas that I found I spend a lot of time dealing with. And so we'll talk a little bit about what I think about why that happens and what to look for and all of that. We're going to break down a bunch of compression stuff the same way, some usage, some tips, some example settings, some ways of using it in a way that maybe is a bit more advanced than what we might be doing now. I know when I first started in that particular realm, it was a very haphazard approach of kind of just moving knobs and hoping for the best result. And then we're going to talk about a few other things as we wind up, and then getting into a little bit more like setting up master channel for some home mastering, some tips and tricks and some things along those lines. I feel like in my experience of doing a lot of my own, mixing from home, and also in a lot of my classes, I've been a proponent of this idea around using reference tracks and using some ways of kind of calibrating our listening environment. And nowadays we have the opportunity to use some of these tools that have been at the disposal of larger facilities, as there's been some software packages that have come out to help us do that, some ways of analyzing audio that's helped sort of, me level the playing field in terms of like hitting a frequency target. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of that stuff today. So I'm going to just share my screen, and I'm going to go through a sort of, notes that I'll talk over. I'll cover most of those points, but you will all get a copy of these notes afterwards, so that you can, follow along with the notes even and rewatch the video if you so choose or whatever. But just to give a little more insight to follow along and all of that. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of calibrate and reference. Now, a lot of the first part here is designed to offer some insight in terms of setting up your room, some things to do for speaker position, and some ways to, I guess, think about the way sound travels in the room. And if you have the opportunity to put up some acoustic control things, and there's some paragraphs in here and some information on all of that. Um, it's going to be in here, so you can go through it, and I'll sort of talk about it a little bit. There's more information that will be in here, but in my experience, most of us, we just don't have this as a reality. So I'm not going to spend too much time covering this stuff, but it'll be a resource for you maybe as you expand your home studio setup. But one thing I will talk a little bit about is the idea that uh, w- as we enter into this realm of really trying to up the game in terms of taking this class, mixing from home, trying to get better results at home, we do want to make sure that at least we can get ourselves set up with a proper monitoring position. So this is something to think about. And here's just an example of what we're going for in this scenario, the ideal way of positioning. And we think about the way that there's like this equilateral triangle. So we've got the speakers the same distance apart as we are from the speakers themselves. that allows us to be able to, hear the best um, in terms of the way that's positioned in the room. Now, ideally, of course, it's like the way that I am here. I'm basically set up kind of in the center of this room with acoustic control all over. There's some tips in this document about if you're taking that route. Um, my experience in most of the students that are taking the mixing from home class, they're not actually there yet. So I'm going to leave this in here and you can refer to it. But if you can move things around and make sure that you've got the right distance, I think that's fairly common sense. I think most of you probably have your speakers not one way off to one side and one really close to you. But the more that you can kind of think about having that equal distance, the better off you can be hearing what you're doing. And the next step of this too is also to think about the height. So we want to be able to have the speakers at ear height, ideally, and then also have them at that sort of triangle. Um, like I said, as you expand on that and you want to be adding acoustic stuff, there's some information in here to do that. It talks a little bit about some of the reflections where, like, in other words, I've got some acoustic control in my room on my left and the right and some bass traps and behind me. And like, how did I position that and why did I position that? So there's some tips in here about taking that step if that's a step that you want to go into. And certainly if there is anyone who's interested in taking that step, you can follow up with an email for me afterwards and we can, go over this if there's any questions about some of this stuff. The main important part now is to take a look at dealing with the realities of where we're working, right? So, what we now have at our disposal, and this is going to sound like, oh, fuck, I took this class and now they're trying to sell me something. But truly, that's not the purpose of this. But the idea here is that when when I was working in my main studios for many years that were um, looked like out of magazines type scenarios, those studios were calibrated. Those rooms were tuned, so to speak, where somebody came in and they used microphones and they played the speakers, and I had done the positioning and sound treatment that I talked about being in this early part of the document and was set up in a nice room, and then they came in to sort of adjust the realities of the way sound is now traveling in that room, because regardless of the amount of sound treatment we put up, regardless of the amount of bass trapping and diffusion and absorption, those are the three key words in acoustic control. But regardless of the amount of that happens, there's still an interaction of the frequencies traveling around a said room based on its size, height, and volume of the room, the speakers themselves, and where they are, and all of that. And so what happens is that those microphones evaluate what's coming out. They play special tones through it and look at the result and analyze it on other computer software. And as a result, they make changes to an EQ that sort of sits there. And that's the way my room was done in New York and also in San Francisco. And that EQ was the room tuning EQ. And anything I played back through that room went through that EQ, which was sat right before my speakers. And then I heard a so-called calibrated listening environment. Now, the part of this that makes it pretty dope today, when we think about where we're at technologically, not only do we have the ability to work off of a laptop with the incredible power that offers, with a potentially an Apollo device on the side that is adding processing power, with plugins that emulating thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars of analog gear that's been sought after and used over and over again throughout the entire music history. But we also now have the ability through this Sonarworks package software that allows us to actually tune our listening environment in a way that rivals what I had done that cost several $1,000s back in the day, but we can sort of incorporate that into our setup. So I don't know who's heard of the Sonarworks room tuning stuff. Um, has anyone not heard of it? Let's see some thumbs or hands. Not heard of it. One not heard of it. Anyone else? So most of you have heard of it. Two hasn't heard of it. Okay. So basically, so three, four. All right. So basically, what it's doing is it's gives us the ability via a piece of software that they sell for, relatively reasonably priced, a few $100. Um, and it offers us the ability to have a calibrated listening environment. Now, why that's important? It's important because if I'm listening and making mixed decisions, adjusting the level of my bass, adjusting the level of my snare or vocal or hi-hat or EQing any one of those elements, but what I'm listening to has a frequency interaction of the speakers in the room that is causing some sort of a boost or dip, or just the nature of the headphones I'm using has a frequency curve built into it. That's what I'm using to make my informed decisions, or so called informed decisions. So by working in a calibrated environment, by adding in this, Sonarworks scenario, it gives me the ability to actually make more accurate decisions. So there's going to be a link in here for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, so you can check it out. But hopefully, I explained the basic idea of what it helps us do. I mean, it helps us make better decisions, right? So when we are mixing from home, from wherever, we can set those levels while listening to a more accurate representation of the reality of the audio that we're hearing. Like I said, everything has some sort of discrepancy to it. So if I just quickly show you, I think I might not have my calibrations loaded, but um, one of the things that they've done is they developed this way of analyzing the frequency response of headphones, their own proprietary way of analyzing the frequency response of headphones, and then create a calibration profile. So I've talked about calibrating the room, like I said, and they create a calibration profile that even works on a lot of headphones, like a lot of headphones, like close to 300 different types of headphones that they've calibrated and offer as a part of the headphone option for this SonarWorks software. But if let me see if I can find mine, just to give you an example real quick. So hopefully my audio will still go through because sometimes it interrupts. So if somebody starts to not hear me, definitely Nick chime in and let me know. But if we take a look here, this is a pair of headphones that sometimes I use. I've chosen this profile of a pair of headphones that sometimes I use. What this is showing me, if we just look right here, it's showing me the before. So this is the before EQ. So basically, this is how I'm listening to my headphones, right? So my headphones sort of have this built-in EQ shape, and that's what I'm listening to. Now, if we look at some frequencies, here's 10K, 10 kilohertz. Here's 100, and so this is like 200. So what those headphones are giving me is a false sense of what's happening at 200 hertz by minus 6 dBs. Like if I just look at this chart and read this. So in other words, I'm listening to these headphones with this inherent EQ curve in the headphones. What I do is then I can apply the calibration, and it shows me the simulated after. So it shows me they now apply a different EQ that fixes it. So if I look at the calibration EQ, this is what they do. So remember before, if I turn on the before and the after, we can see they're inverse of one another. So where I had peaks and dips, they've done dips and peaks, if that makes sense. So they basically allow me to use a not very expensive. These are actually my DJ headphones, and I have this calibrated just for going through promos and listening to music before I DJ. You know, calibrated listening environment. But the advantage of that, if you think about just trying to mix on these headphones or any other types, for example, but what I'm listening to is this dip here. Like, how am I really going to make an accurate decision? Right. So that's an example of how this SonarWorks software kind of is able to offer us the ability to go in and making decisions in a way that is more accurate. So when I start to, um, like I said, do leveling and EQing around areas where my headphones are insufficient or extra sufficient, like where they're boosting certain frequencies, like we saw around 10K. Like that's going to change how I would EQ or level, for example, a hi-hat. So this stuff is just happening. I mean, the one thing that's interesting is that, like I said, when I was like right now, I'm in a home studio and I use the Sonarworks calibration here. But for many, many years before now, before technology allowed me the advantage of being able to have a smaller home studio computer based with some hardware type scenario, um, I had to be in a bigger room, more proper studio, and those were all tuned. Like somebody came in and analyzed this, and then and basically, set myself up to be able to make better decisions. And it's invisible, but what's happening is sound is traveling all around the room. Now, in many cases, we're working on headphones, and so we saw the prime example of how the headphones is offering me a different listening environment. It's not reality, and this SonarWorks software allows me calibrate it even in headphones, but on my speakers too. Like sound is traveling around this room. If you can imagine a pool table with 20,000 balls on it, just all being thrown at me, they're all going to then bounce around, just like the pool table sides is just like my room sides, right? And it's just going to all bounce around. And sometimes those frequencies gang up on one another and cause them to be louder. And sometimes those frequencies bang into each other and cause them to be lower or stop or whatever. And so, even though the audio that we're hearing coming out of our speakers is invisible, it is interacting. Like those sound waves are interacting with our space. And so SonarWorks takes that to another level by saying, okay, I can calibrate your listening environment in a traditional way. They have a package that comes with the microphone. Like their most expensive package comes with the microphone, and you analyze the frequencies of your room, and then it creates a calibrated curve. And I use that, but I also have the headphone calibrations because they took it that step further and gave us the ability to calibrate our headphones. The thing about this is it's had such a positive impact on me and the probably 25 individual friends of mine that I know that make music that I've talked to about this and was like, "Hey, you guys should try this." I mean, it's just insane. Like I don't work for them, I don't get a commission, but it's insane. I was the one that brought this to IO Academy a couple years ago when I sat down. I was like, "Hey, dude, for you guys, your students that are working from home, working in headphones, or even for your studios here, like it just makes it so much better and easier, and it's more confidence building. Like when I work on a calibrated environment and I make my decisions and I play it out and it sounds pretty close to how I intended. And sure, I may want to tweak the level of the vocal or maybe adjust the bass or change the rhythm on the snare or something, but it's a lot farther to or closer to my end result than like in before. Some of you may have had that experience. My guess is that all the hands are going to go up if you've had the experience where you work on a mix and you think it sounds great in your studio or on your headphones, and then you either play it out or play it in the car or play it at your friend's place or play it in the club, and you're like disappointed. Like that is not how it was supposed to sound, right? So this gives us the opportunity to be able to add this software package into our ability to calibrate our listening environment, make better choices, and make better mixes at home. I tell this story that a friend of mine that I've known for a really long time, and he's been making music since the 90s, so have I. And I finally got him to use this. And he was like, "Yeah, I threw it on. I had my headphones and I was just messing around with the track on my laptop and, you know, made a file and popped it on in the car," and he's like, "It was the first time in 20 something years that it actually sounded the way I thought in the car." He's like, "I'm used to that process of, like, doing it, listening to it, and going, 'Yeah, it's totally messed up. Alright, so I'll go fix it,' and then get closer and to inch closer." But he's like, "This is the first time where it actually sounded the way it intended in the car," and I wasn't even trying to mix. I wasn't trying to do anything, but I just, by listening to it with Sonarworks on, I was calibrating and it fixed my headphones so that I made better choices, more reality, not affected by that EQ curve like my headphones I showed. And then he was like, "Dude, it's really the first time it actually sounded the way it was intended." So it's a huge tool, and it's a big part of being able to make better choices. The headphone edition I think is $99. I think even taking this class gives you a discount because we've got a relationship with them with IO Academy. I'm not sure on that, but either way, the headphone edition alone is $99, where it comes with calibrations for like 200 pairs of headphones. And if your headphones are on that list, you're stoked. You're on your way to being able to make even better decisions and utilize everything else we're going to talk about in a more relevant way. Like we can talk about EQ, we can talk about compression all day long. We can, go through all of these things that will help you, that will learn a little bit more about some of the tools or whatever that we're going to talk about over the next 5 days, or any YouTube video you're going to find. But if at the end of the day, what you're listening to isn't quite right, then you're always going to have that guessing game of trying to like navigate that and figure that out. And this helps level that playing field. So it's a huge thing, and I'm just putting a push in there for us to do it. And it's a big part of this idea of being able to make better quality results, at home. Another thing to think about, and again, there's a link in here. Their website's got way more information. I think I covered the basics, the nuts and bolts of it. The website's got way more information on it, and you can decide if this is something you want to do for yourself, but it's very valuable. If you are listening in on speakers, I want to just put a quick little plug in here for evaluating and monitoring your listening level. The listening level is important because the research says, and people who are way smarter than me that study hearing and audiology and all of that, um, show that the ear hears the flattest frequency response at a more moderate level than what we might think, in terms of not too loud, not too soft, but in other words, a moderate level. The sort of bedroom calibration number for that is in the mid to upper 70s in terms of dB SPL. Now, for those that don't know, this is a unit of measure for analyzing loudness in the world. So we use, meters, peak meters, RMS meters, LUFS meters, or LUFS meters in our software. We're going to talk about some of those and how we can use them. But in the real world, when we're listening through speakers, analyzation of loudness is this unit of measure of dB SPL, or sound pressure level. Remember, I was talking about the way the sound travels around the room. So it's analyzing the level of that sound, how loud your speakers are, basically. Um, so I put this little chart in here to give us an idea, because when I first started to talk about this or think about this listening level, one of the first numbers that starts to get thrown around is like 83 dB. And maybe you've heard of that, watched a video on it, or had a conversation with a buddy about it. 83 dB listening level sounds good. 85 dB listening level is one of the first things that I heard, that I started to think about. But the reality is when I tried that, it's way too loud. And the reason for that is that the people who came up with this idea of SPL calibration for listening level were the high budget film mixing studios. And so when you think about how they mix a movie, and I'll tell you how they mix a movie is they mix it in a massive movie theater with a soundboard right in the middle. So it's a big space that can house 400 people sitting down. Its cubic volume, its room size is massive, right? It's, this 20,000 number, or greater than 20,000 number, is length times width times height. So in other words, the length of the room, the width of the room, and the height of the room are all multiplied by one another to come up with this number. So this high pressure, or mid 80s or low 80s SPL number, comes from that background. It doesn't work for us in smaller rooms, smaller studios. In my bedroom, which is about 1,200, or my home studio is about 1,200 square feet, or cubic feet, sorry, length times width times height. My room is about 12 feet by 11 feet with 9-foot ceilings. It's kind of your average, bedroom slash home studio, right? So they say that the listening level for that size room is about 74. For me, I've got old club ears. I like to push that a little bit. So for me, I like about 77. But the idea here is that I'm still in this moderate level that allows me to hear a flatter frequency response. And again, why that's important talks about why calibrating my listening environment is important. Like if I'm listening too loud and my ear isn't hearing the frequencies flatter, I'm going to make totally different decisions. And for me, I had a situation where I had calibrated my room wrong and it was too loud. And I noticed that I was mixing really with like mid range and high end light, because that stuff was already so loud that I was softening it naturally in the mix, and then I would play it out and it was on. I had to recalibrate my listening environment. That's just an example of what happened to me. But normally that's what happens. If you mix too loud, you come out with, more bass, less mids and highs than you might think. And if you mix too low, you're going to come out with way more bass, because if it's too low in volume, you're not hearing the low end as much, and so you're going to turn it up more than you're supposed to. So this is just a play to a guide to help decide what to do with that and where to be with that. And then what I put in here is some tools that I use to evaluate SPL, right? Like I said, um, DBSPL or 7477, whatever number it is, DBSPL is an evaluation of the real world. So I can't just use my software to figure that out. I've got to have some sort of way of evaluating the sound around me. And these are just little iPhone apps. These are two of them that are for iPhones. Here's one that's for Android, and they're relatively reasonably priced. There's even this free version works fine. It just kind of times out and doesn't remember your settings. But anyway, the point is there's some ways if you're not on headphones and you are on speakers and you want to get a sense of what your listening level is, what that where you're normally used to it, and you might find yourself sitting right in there already, and so then that's valuable. What I did is I evaluated my sort of like mastering level and used my SPL meter and kind of got a sense of where I'm supposed to be on my monitor controller. Like I know how loud my monitors are, and if I'm a finished master, I should be right around there. And so I can sort of just set that, and then now it helps me know, um, where and like, oh, I'm too loud or too soft. I have to adjust my limiter or whatever, right? So it just can sort of help figure that out. But certainly when I'm mixing, and if I'm really trying to like fine tune the mix and get to that last step of like really making sure before I'm ready to go, like, yeah, this is a done mix. I definitely, try to take a second and make sure that I'm at the right level, and then I can really evaluate where, my highs, mids, and lows are in a more accurate setting. Of course, also using Sonarworks, also utilizing proper placement on my speakers, and sort of combining all of these steps to be able to, compete with some of these, people that aren't just trying to mix at home and that have some of these bigger studios. Uh, sorry. Another piece. What I put here is a little quote from this article. I'm a huge nerd, so a couple of years ago, I actually spent some time researching these SPL meters, and I found a couple of people who were bigger nerds than me, and they actually did a PhD thesis on uh, SPL levels meters. In other words, handheld device or smartphone apps that analyze loudness, and they recommend these few here because they're very accurate. So I just put a little quote in there and a link to the full article. The next piece of the puzzle here that has helped me a lot achieve um, really good quality results is utilizing reference material. And the way I talk about this is in a way that it helps me set a frequency target. So it separates out the creative process from the mixing process. I'm talking about as our class is titled mixing from home, right? So we're in that finishing phase. The creative part, we've done our job, we made it sound how we think and arranged it, and the groove is right, and blah 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 blah, right? We wrote the song, we did that, and now we're going to take it to that next step of like, now we want it to compete and sound great and ultimately impress our friends, right? Play it for your buddy who also makes music and he's like, damn, that sounds really good, right? That's what we're going for. But ultimately, what this idea has done, this utilization of reference material, this setting of a frequency target, has given me a roadmap and helped me achieve a quality of sound that's beyond what I was getting before with less revisions. And when I add that to a calibrated listening environment, to proper speaker position, and all of this type of things that we're talking about, I'm able to actually do really, really, really high quality work in an environment that is, less than ideal. Um, so the way this came about for me, a quick sort of history as to the why of it is when I first started in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I first started having the budget to get records mastered properly, like from an actual mastering engineer. So there was like, I wasn't having to do it all myself. I would go to these mastering places and I noticed that there was a lot of music lying around. And back in the day, because I'm old, there was CDs everywhere. And you guys are going to be like, what's a CD? But anyway, there was CDs lying everywhere in the rooms. And inquiring about that, it was like basically the reply boils down to this: as the mastering engineer, they're the last part of this chain of making something sound the best that it can, and also make it sound the best that it can in as many different listening environments as possible, as relevant to the genre, as relevant to good sounding music, proper frequency balance that's going to sound great. Not just taking one song on an album and make it sound just as good as track 2 and 3 and 4, and that it's all even level and all that, but ultimately how to shape the frequencies that it really fits and sounds great when it goes out into the world on all these different speakers. And so for them, it was really, really important to know what good sounding music sounded like in their room and really get familiar with that, because they're the responsible person, the last step in this chain of production that takes your piece of music and makes it sound the best that it can. So as much as we try to make, our mixes sound really great and, work hard and, utilize the stuff at our disposal to make stuff sound really good, they are really, really responsible for when it leaves for them. There's nobody else going to work on it. And when it plays, it's got to be loud, it's got to be clear, the frequency's got to be balanced, right? And that's their job. And how they were able to do that, one of the ways is, of course, they're using very expensive monitors. They're definitely working in a calibrated room where they had somebody come with microphones and adjusted and calibrated it. But also, after that's done and their acoustic control and everything, they spend a lot of time listening to music to really know what good sounding music sounds like in there, getting very, very familiar with that so that when they press play on what I was sending them to master, they could immediately evaluate that and go, okay, I know this room. I know what good sounding music is supposed to be in this room. I know that your song is too much bass or it's not bright enough or too much highs or whatever, and they can start to dial that in. That comes from spending time really knowing what good sounding music sounds like in their room. So I took that information back and I started to, apply that more and more to what I was doing, using reference tracks more and more to what I was doing. Now, fast forward 20 years of using reference material, I've gotten to the point now where we can utilize some technology that I'm going to get into next that helps me level match those. So now I'm listening even more accurately to different pieces of music and the idea of how I then use them. But ultimately, what it offers me is an additional way of knowing where I'm going, right? So when I first usually bring this up for people, they say, well, but I don't want to copy anybody else and I don't want to, I'm trying to do my own thing, which is perfectly, totally valid. The idea behind using these reference tracks is not from a production standpoint. It's not from a what snare they use standpoint. That happens in the creative process, and maybe you'll listen to stuff to be inspired, maybe you won't. But what the way that I design this and what we're going to talk about, it allows me the ability to sort of bypass any sort of production that they're doing, but really listen for the way and the consistency of what good sounding music sounds like, and then compare that to where I'm at in my mix, right? So that gives me the opportunity to achieve a better quality result because I'm guiding myself. I'm giving myself that target. It's like if I said to you, um, okay, we're hanging out at a bar where there's that pool table in the back that I use to do my audio around the room scenario. And now we're over here and we're looking at the darts, and there's some darts. And I say, okay, let's play darts, throw them at the wall. And then you throw them at the wall, and then I put the dartboard up after. That's the equivalent of making something at home and then doing the car test. And in the car test, you're like, okay, well, here's the dartboard, and I didn't hit it. But if I was to put that dartboard up first and then say, okay, now let's play darts, like now at least you know where you're aiming for, right? You're either going to hit it or you're not. You still would wish you could do it better and make some changes, but you're certainly going to be a lot more accurate if I gave you a target, right? So if I set a frequency target, then it can help me mix closer to where I'm trying to end up. So now how do I do that? Well, one of the things that I'll do is that I use multiple frequency targets. I don't just use one. And I think let's see, do I talk about that later? Yeah, I talk about that later. So ultimately, what I want to do is I want to be able to use some material that I've chosen, just like the mastering engineers that I talked about, where they chose reference material that sounded really good. I want to be able to make that choice and have a few pieces of music that I think sound really good. And then what I want to do is I want to level match them. Now, the idea behind this is that The ear and brain are very sensitive. In fact, they're so sensitive that they're more instinctual. Like, usually, our evaluation of frequencies or loudness happens before we think about it. There's a very fast connection that goes on right there. And in some crazy research that sometimes I'll add in lengthier classes of this sort, they sort of talk about this idea that, like, it's sort of hardwired from ancestry in a sense, right? Because ultimately, if I was back in the hunter gatherers of, many, many years ago, a louder sound would need more of my attention because it was closer and it could mean that I'm in danger, right? Back when we were hunted along with being a hunter. Nowadays, we don't have to worry about that, but still, a louder sound gets more attention, or the music phrase of this is louder sounds better. You may have heard that term that people say, "Oh, louder sounds better." Try not to be tricked by louder sounds better. So sometimes, if I just turn something up, I think, "Oh, that sounds better." It's like, well, it's louder. Does it really sound better? Like, I really need to evaluate that. That instinct is happening on a level that's pretty deep. So what I want to do is to help eliminate that. And in the last few years, there's been a way of evaluating loudness via this LUFS technology. And loudness unit full scale is what LUFS stands for. But what it offers us is a way to analyze loudness digitally, like in the computer, and gives us the ability to create level matched music. Now, the end result of this is what we are hearing when we're listening to Spotify or Pandora or Apple Music. They're using the LUFS, loudness unit numbers, and they are level matching all of the songs so that when you press play on your playlist, you don't have to constantly change the volume knob, right? Um, so they use the LUFS technology to be able to, have us enjoy a playlist that in some cases might expand multiple genres. We could set up a scenario where we use LUFS technology to level match a James Taylor record from the 70s and a Skrillex record from lately and have them be a relatively similar listening experience in loudness. Without the LUFS level matching, I'm sure there would be a huge discrepancy in that loudness. But if we take that to a step further, in when I'm trying to set myself up for a frequency target, I use the LUFS technology to level match these reference tracks. I don't want to have to have one reference track be inherently a little bit louder because that mastering engineer put a little more gain or compression on it, or in another one, maybe a little bit less. So this gives us a way to utilize our reference material even more accurately, this LUFS technology. And I'm going to show you some of these free meters that I use. There's two different ones. We'll take a look at both if that's what you're doing. How about a show of hands for people who are already familiar with LUFS technology? Sort of, and yes. Okay, a couple people have video off. That's fine. So, all right. So you may be familiar with it already. The cool thing is, as I said, is it gives us a very accurate way of level matching. And so now we have the ability to utilize this reference music in a level matched way to make them more relevant. So there's a couple of these plugins that I have links to in here. These are both free plugins that give us the ability to use LUFS metering, which when I pull them up in a little while, I'll talk a little bit more about and show you them and give you some more of the details of what they're doing. Um, so now for my reference tracks, I talked about just a second ago how I want to get away from the mindset of production. Like, I'm not trying to use these reference tracks to copy the way that they did their drum programming. I'm really trying to use them to give me that frequency target, to sort of play them back and to listen to how the low, mids, and highs sit across this frequency range that can help, guide me where I'm going to want to be. So how I pick them is it's songs that I think sound good. Or in other words, it's songs that you think sound good. And also, I don't just use one or two. I try to use 3 to 5 and even more. My list of reference tracks now has grown even further, but you can start with about 3 to 5. What the 3 to 5, what that helps to do is to separate the production, because all 5 of those will have a little bit different production, a little bit different arranging, but they will still offer a very accurate representation of frequency. And then what you'll end up with is one of them will be a little bit brighter, one will be a little bit bassier, but that will give you a range. So now you'll have a range across the frequency spectrum, across level matched pieces of music that you thought sound really good, like you vetted them, and you said, I want my music to sound like that. And you pick those 5 and you level match them to one another, and then you listen to them, and you'll see that, like, oh, okay, this bass is a little light, this bass is a little heavy. If my bass sits kind of right in the middle there, I'm in good shape. This one of those reference tracks might be a little bit brighter on the, 10K or 16K, whatever. One might be a little bit softer. The rest might be somewhere in the middle. If you end up somewhere in the middle, you're pretty much okay. So again, that's where the implementations of these gives me that sort of frequency roadmap. I'm not just trying to use one track where I can get too bogged down into like what they did to the snare or this or the hi-hat or whatever. But when I'm using multiples, I'm just sort of separating out my listening and just going, okay, let me just feel the way the low, mids, and highs are in this track, in this track, in this track, in this track, the similarities, the differences, what's louder in what range, what's softer in what range, how they give me now that range that I can now use to guide my choices and my level. And the way that I choose to implement them is I take it to the next step here is where I edit it down to kind of like the meat of the song or the main part of the song. And I only need like 15 to 30 seconds or so of the song. 30 seconds or so is fine. And I can leave a little bit before and after if I want, but I just sort of edit it down a bit, and I've got these, 5 different reference tracks. I take like the main drop, main section of the song, and I edit it down a little bit. And we'll see how that's implemented on the screen. I'll start to show you this right now because now we're starting to get into looking at how I set this up. Um, let's see. Let's open up class sessions folder and find my reference tracks. All right. So if we take a look now at this idea behind using several of them, I've got a couple of different tracks here that's based around a couple of different pieces along the process, the way I described it. So this first track is showing fully just sort of dropped in songs, right? So this is like 5 or 6, dropped in songs. And then I talked about how I edit them down, right? So now when I edit them down, I end up with a much more like smaller group to be evaluating. And the reason I like to do it like this is that when I want to listen to them, and if I give you a quick example of how I would listen to them, you guys will be able to hear this, but like reality is the hearing is less important. But like, and these are a couple different genres too. But the idea here is that, let's see, that didn't work, did it? Nobody can hear that. I can't hear that. So let me just double check this real quick. Come on. All right, I'm just going to stop the screen share real quick and restart it because that will usually help me. If I hit that, yeah, here we go. All right, so open this up again. So basically what we saw there is the top track showed just a whole bunch of reference tracks that I brought in, and then I edit them down. Now, what I was saying is that the reason that I edit them down is so that they become pretty valuable when I go to play them. So now we can hear that. It's a little bit loud, so I'm just going to bring that down a bit, just so it's in the background. So the reason I edit this down is that now when I'm trying to utilize them, I can kind of jump. And what I'm getting is something very relevant. So if I leave them all up here, like these full tracks, right, it's like it's gonna A, take up so much on the screen, but if I play, like, accidentally play in the middle here, before it's kicked in, it's like takes less time, right? So when I go through and I find the most relevant meat of the section, it gives me a nice and concise little area of a bunch of tracks that I can sort of use this in a bunch of different sessions. Now, I can have this and import this track into a bunch of different sessions and, use them as reference material. And it also allows me to really quickly be able to jump between them. Because one of the ideas too, and I covered this really sort of glazed over it, but I said the ear is very instinctual. Like the way we hear is very instinctual. So I want to be able to sort of help myself live in that realm of relying on my evaluation of frequency on an instinctual level. So I want to shorten the length of time between my evaluation pieces, right? So if I can jump through here and just press quick play, then I can now click back and jump into the song I'm mixing. It gives me a very quick, very relevant analysis of the main part of the song, 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 really seeing and feeling how those frequencies are sitting. And then I click on my song, and then I can go, oh, clearly I need to boost whatever this or take some of this away, right? To make that even more accurate now, we then level match them to one another. I think some of these were already, if I look here. No, actually they weren't. So it's still, useful to just utilize the reference tracks in this way, but to make it now even more useful, I then level match them to one another so that they become more, just more valuable. Um, Again, I'm using the same idea behind the level matching that occurs on the playlist in Spotify, what they're doing. This LUFS technology gives us the ability to listen into things like compression and limiting. So, because this is one of the downfalls that people will say is like, well, if I'm using mastered tracks and my track is just kind of mixed, how do I use reference tracks? Well, we finally have the ability to do that because of this LUFS technology. These were extremely smart scientists, more nerdy than me, I'm sure, that were brought in to evaluate the way we hear loudness and then figure out what that means on a digital realm and create a way of making that relevant, even if something is more compressed than something else. The initial implementation of this comes from the idea that many years ago, when we would watch a TV show and then the commercial would come on, the commercial was really loud. With the onset of digital limiters, we could make stuff, really, really, really loud. That was, louder than what was possible in the analog realm. And so advertising agencies were like, well, shit, we want, let's make it louder. Let's make it louder. Let's make it louder. There was no real standard involved for the distribution of the audio across TV commercials. But there was still a standard across the distribution of audio on the actual programs themselves. The networks themselves would have delivery requirements for the audio levels, and the people who would do the mixing on the TV shows of all the audio and sound effects and the words and everything. They had certain, numbers that they had to reach, and they would deliver that. And then the advertisers were like, well, we're just going to use these digital limbers and make it really loud so that when people go to the bathroom as they're walking down the hallway, we're going to still keep their attention. Well, I think a bunch of people got fed up with that and said, okay, your industry needs to come up with a way that this doesn't happen. And so this was the initial implementation of this LUFS technology. It was initially called something different, and there's a numbered term for it, like 1877 IPT, whatever. But ultimately, for us, it's been boiled down to this way of analyzing loudness that's very accurate and has the ability to listen into limiting and compression and still give us a relevant number. So, now if you notice when you're watching TV, the difference in volumes of the TV commercials and the programs themselves, although who really watches TV anymore anyway? But the point is that the technology is there and they've been using it so that there isn't that huge discrepancy from TV commercial who was delivering it with these certain numbers and, or TV program, which was delivering to numbers and commercials, which weren't, and we're just compressing it to sound louder. So LUFS, we now can use that in music to give us a more calibrated listening environment for our frequency target. So now we take our 5 reference tracks, we edit them down to the meat, and then we use the LUFS technology to level match them to one another. Now we're just getting each step of the game gets us more accurate, more quickly be able to reference and use them, and be able to use them in a way that's really relevant. So with this in mind, this is our, first step is we bring in the reference track. Second step is I edit them down to sort of their main sections so that I can quickly click play, click play, and have them, stay right where the main parts of the songs, and then I'll click in my main part of the song and be able to make a informed decision without having to take a lot of time to, jump over to Spotify or jump over to iTunes and jump back to Logic and or to Ableton or Logic or whatever, and make sure it's level mat right. It's like pull them right into the session, edit them down to the meat, and then the next step to make them more accurate is level matching them. So I talked about some of these tools. So let's see, I probably have these tools on the master. So this is one of the tools that I linked to. This Yolian loudness one. It looks a little different when you open it. It has this histogram off to the right, which basically shows you the way loudness, its analyzation of loudness on the input, but I don't look at that. It gives me some numbers here, which I'm going to dive into. And here's another one of the free ones. I choose this EBU, which is their abbreviation for LUFS. And it gives me some numbers. Now you notice there's some similarity. We've got integrated, we've got short term, and we've got momentary. And then over here, we've got short term, integrated, and we have this momentary max. And we have a few other things to look at, but ultimately, the way that this is used, this LUFS technology, works off of 3 planes of evaluating loudness. There's a momentary analyzation of loudness, there's a short-term analyzation of loudness, and there's an integrated analyzation of loudness. So we come up with sort of 3 numbers. What those are is momentary is fast. It's a little bit more like a peak meter. Like it's going to show you the large difference in loudness. It's evaluating it over moments, very fast moments. It's a momentary analyzation. Short term is analyzing loudness over a short term. So it's a little bit more of an average, right? Similar, if you may have heard of an RMS meter, or that's a peak meter and an RMS meter are similar to a momentary or short term in the LUFS metering technology. Similar, but not the same. And then we also have the integrated part. Now, integrated is usually the entire length. So when I was talking about that example of films and TV shows, they usually have numbers that they have to meet. They can't exceed momentary loudness over this. Their short term has to be, between this and the, integrated, or in other words, the entire length of the program can't be greater than this unless, and people will sort of make adjustments to their mix so that they meet these individual requirements with these LUFS specs. And Netflix and HBO and NBC all have different specs but similar, but they're using these ways of analyzing loudness to do it. We're now coordinating that, or sort of taking this technology to help use us in music, because of the way that I mentioned, where it has the ability to listen into compression and limiting and create relevance from an unmixed mix and a mastered reference track, and we can still utilize them. So the 3 different types, momentary, short-term, integrated, uh, are the pieces of the numbers that you're going to see. We're going to pay the most attention to the short-term and the integrated. The momentary is moving kind of fast, and like I said, it's a little bit like peak numbers, and so it's a little bit less relevant. I'm going to look for more of an average. Now, the reason that integrated also works to our favor is because we've shortened the length that it's analyzing. Because we've edited these songs down to just the meat, the integrated number can help us, because it's a nice slow moving number, which will show us kind of where we are. But I look at short term and integrated and kind of come up with this, sort of in between average. Now, the way I sort of tell people to do it. And for most genres, it works. It's a little bit harder if you're trying to do, like dubstep. But most genres, it works. Where the how or what I level match these two is a -10 LUFS. So I use -10 integrated slash short term on the LUFS meters, and that's how I level match these, or what I level match them to. What LUFS I level match these reference tracks to. Now, in order to do that, it's usually going to take a couple of dBs to be able to meet that requirement. And I think what I've done is I've done it on some of these. So I just bring the gain down. On this one, it took 3.9 to reach where I wanted it to reach. This one took 3.2. This one took a lot, 4.9, so almost 5 dBs down. This one only 1.7. This one only 1.4 down. This one only 1.1 down. This one only 2.2 down. So there's an example of that louder sounds better. I don't know about you, but it's kind of hard for me to hear um, differences of 1 dB, but 2 to 3 dBs I can hear level changes of 2 dB, or I can hear that pretty well. 1 dB sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. But if I'm trying to use these reference tracks, all of them together, and one of them has to come down 5 dB and one only comes down 1 dB, we're talking about potentially a 4 dB difference between what I'm listening to. So I have to listen to that, and my brain has to somehow try to think like, oh, well, sure, okay, on this one the highs are going to be louder because it's louder, or on this one the lows are going to be louder because it's louder, or this one it's got less low end because it's actually lower. So I'm going to take that out of the equation, right? So now I go in and I level match them. So I've already done that to some of these, so that what happens is now when I use these short little regions. Now, even though this and this are these three are pretty different genres, they still offer me some insight into good sounding music. Now, remember, I picked these because I thought these records sounded really good. So they're offering me directly related insight to where I think I'm setting my frequency target. And when I level match them, even though their genres are completely different, it's still, I get a feeling of where the low, mids, and highs are supposed to be. The rhythm is different, the key is different, the vibe is different, but ultimately they still have a similar effect on the frequency response. Now, if I continue down the line here where these are all kind of like housey tech house songs, now I've made the genre even closer. I've made the level match to help make the more relevant frequency rise and edited them all to the meat. Now I've just taken it even one more step by narrowing the genre with what I'm doing, narrowing the amount of the song. So I'm playing just the relevant parts, the main sections of each, and then I'm level matching them. Now I can even get more accurate with my sort of analyzation of my frequency target that's set by these songs that I picked, right? So now we can see how this feels. This one only came down a dB and a half. This is listening to the low, mids, and highs. A little hard for us on headphones in this teaching environment, but the idea is here. It feels that it's about the same volume, and yet this piece came down 1.5 or 1.1. This one came down 1.5. This one came down 2.5. That came down about 2. So these are similar, but still I've narrowed that scope, right? And this one came down a lot, like almost 5. But still, what I have now is a very accurate frequency representation set by my vetted reference tracks that I think sound really good, that I can quickly jump to and just sort of help my, um, calibrate my frequencies, and my mix. So by referring to these as my frequency target and then jumping back to my mix, I can quickly see that, like, for example, I've got too much low mids, which is a common mistake, or I'm not bright enough, or whatever the case may be for you and your vetted tracks. So, like, I'm not up here saying you have to choose these and these are the end all be all of what sounds good. I'm saying you're going to do that. You're going to decide your frequency target. You're going to listen to a bunch of stuff. You're going to listen to a bunch of music in the studio, listen to a bunch of music on your headphones in your car, whatever. Pick 10 songs, narrow it down to 5, and be like, okay, these songs all sound pretty darn good. I think we got a couple questions in the chat related to this, so let me just take a peek in here and see what we've got. Am I strictly bringing down the dB by ear? And can I adjust one? Yeah, I'm going to actually adjust one right now, so I'm going to show you. So I'm using one of these two LUFS meters to do it. Here's my region of the one that came down 4.96. If I default that, and what I said is that I recommend just using -10 LUFS to start. It's the way that I do it. I know what we're going to talk about on Friday, which is about mastering and how I then take that into account and all of that. And so we don't have to worry about our final loudness being too low. Like, we're going to sort of take this into account. But ultimately, I found that, I usually have to bring most songs down a couple of dBs to reach this -10 number. But if I shot for -9, I think I have one of my reference tracks in another set or two that actually won't, they're lower than that already. So for me, when I started, -10 was that lowest common denominator, and that was my lowest one, and I brought them all down, to match in various levels. So -10 is a good starting point just because it takes the guesswork out of it. But I've got this one, and I am looking at the integrated and short-term numbers. We've got short-term up here and integrated here, 2 different meters, the same number, same technology. So I take a look at where this is at. Like, that's super loud. And then I just sort of adjust it. Now, I can see that this is giving me about 5.8, which is almost 6, 5.5 integrated. This integrated number seems a little bit off, but ultimately this 5.8 over here is kind of matching. So I'm going to start by bringing these down about 4, 4.5. Let's just see what that looks like now. Looks close. So I just, nudge this down a little bit and start it again. So one thing about my nudging it and starting again, my workflow here, where I press play, I take a look at the number, and then I'm sort of starting it again. There's 2 pieces here that work with this. So this this was off. That's why that 10 number got weird. So basically what this is saying is that because the integrated specifically is analyzing all loudness coming in, right? So when I set this auto, what it does is it sort of quickly resets every time the space bar like stops and starts and plays. If I was, doing a TV show, I'd have to have it, ganging up and getting my, relative integrated loudness for the entire thing. It's not going to stop. But in this environment, I want it to sort of auto work with me so that it sort of resets, because integrated is going to take in and continually give me that number. Short term is going to give me over a short term. So I don't necessarily have to reset that every time, because after a couple seconds, I'm going to get a new number. Does that make sense? Hopefully. The same thing on this plugin. There's the sync button, which I have on. And what that does is that when I press play, you'll notice it kind of starts at 0, then gives me a number. So I stop it, and when I start again, it goes back to sort of nothing and then builds up from there. So it happens really quickly, same with this one. So the auto is important so that I can, continually be evaluating loudness accurately. So anyway, my point is that, like, I'm playing the meat of this song, and I'm taking a look at my number, and I'm dialing it in. So that's pretty close here. My integrated number is a bit louder there, so I might come down just a hair more. The short-term number is hovering right around 10. My integrated number is hovering right around 10. So that to me is good. It's within 1 or 2 tenths of a dB of that -10. And so as I evaluate the next one, it's the same type of thing. This one came down 1.77, but if I just have it zeroed out, I take a look at where it is. I've got my sync on, I'm looking at short term and integrated. So I'm a couple dBs louder than I want to be. So I'll try taking it down, minus 1.5 maybe to start. Start it over to just sort of get a quick reset. I'm pretty close at 1.5, I'm pretty close. In fact, I'm pretty much spot on. So it's pretty easy to do that, as you see. The numbers give me a guide, right? So when I looked at this one, it's not exactly necessarily a one-to-one guide, because this, if we see this this track that I have selected here, is you know is pretty loud, and I came down 4.5 dBs here, right? So if I bring that back to 0 and I look at the number, it's pretty close to one-to-one, but not quite. But when I look at where this is, actually, yeah, that's really close to sort of a one-to-one. Like if I want this to be at -10, I would take 4.5 away from this, or 4.4 away from this based on these numbers. But so I can just quickly look at where these are in these LUFS meters to start, and then use that to just sort of go, okay, let's see what this sounds at -4.5 and how close I am. That's pretty good. So now, once I go through this level matching here, now I've got this relevant frequency target that I can utilize when I'm, now when I'm working. And I can, take a pause and jump through and listen to these and really get a sense of where I'm sitting there on the frequencies. And like I said, I'm listening to them really quickly. I've edited them down, and I'm using more than one. So as a result, my quickly listening back and forth, it allows me to just focus on the frequency and just how it's hitting the lows, mids, and highs, and the brightness of the elements, not the individual pieces that are used for the clap itself, but the overall high end, the overall mid range. So I can get a sense of where that's sitting. And again, I talked about the range. So this one is brighter. I can hear that's a little bit brighter. This one is bright as well, but actually no, it's duller. So there's a good range out of these 5 that I have. I wouldn't want to be duller than this one, and I wouldn't want to be brighter than this one, in a sense, right? Because that's kind of similar, but not quite as bright and shimmery as this one. This one's close, but also not quite as bright and shimmery, but similar. But so this is where it starts to provide me that range. And so now I can listen to those really quickly, get a sense of where I am frequency-wise, and then be able to apply that to what I'm doing. Now, okay, so let's take a look. Can you adjust one and see how it works? All right, so I think my adjusting one, we saw how using those 2 free plugins, with the edited down pieces, I look at where they're at, I bring the gain down on the clip gain or sample level, and just sort of adjust those to one another. And then someone said, what setting affects the brightness? Well, there's no setting that affects the brightness. The brightness is coming from these individual tracks. And so, like I mentioned, they offer me a range. So if you find in your range, when you've picked your songs, that one is really significantly far off in brightness, let's use that example. If one is really significantly off in brightness, I would, maybe reevaluate that. If I've got 4 that are pretty close in brightness, maybe one's a little brighter or whatnot, and then one that's really dull, then I personally would say, well, maybe I'm not going to use that as a reference track, because maybe it sounds okay, but if 4 of the ones that I thought, sat here brightness level, and then this last one is kind of down here, it's yeah, I might try to look for another one. Or knowing that that particular one is on the dull side, then that can give you that range. And you know that, okay, the 4 are here, so you want to be closer up to here on that side of the range, or the average, versus duller than this one that's dull, right? So it still can even offer a good reference point. Someone says, should you send the reference tracks to a bus other than the master bus so you don't pick up the master bus effects in the normal workflow? You could, yeah, but the way that I have this session set up is I don't really it's all off on the master, so none of this stuff is working. So I just level match this here, but it would be the same if I just copied these and level matched them on the track itself. So I could drop these on the track itself, which is perfectly fine to get that -10, level match. Now, when I want to use them on my master, like, what I would do is if I've got, um, so I mean, this sort of takes this a step further in that, like, if I'm using these in an actual mix, then what I'm actually going to do is route my entire mix to its own bus or group, and that group is what's going to get any eventual mastering or master bus effects. So mastering, compression, limiting, and all that stuff is going to go separately. So I've got my reference tracks going dry to the master, and then I've got my track going to its own group. That's me. I consider the sort of master bus for the track I'm working on, right? And so that way it separates it out so that I've got my analyzation on my master, so I can set up my master channel for analyzation. And we're going to talk about this actually when we do on Friday, when we talk about sort of implementing this further down the line and how to continue to use these reference tracks in a relevant way, but in a mastering scenario. Now we're trying to finish something that we mixed at home, right? So we are going to take that a step further. But yeah, but basically I separate that out. So I've got a sort of fake master bus that all my production tracks go to, and that's where I do any processing to the track I'm working on. Then my reference track, and both of those now go to my master. And for me, on my master, I end up with just analytical tools, right? So here we see I've got my Sonarworks plugin. It opened in a different window, so we'll just, yeah, see if I can grab that. So I've got this plugin over here, which doesn't, yeah, it's got this one loaded for these other headphones. Um, I've got a utility on here, which is just for us. I also have this limiter, but I actually just use this limiter as an additional tool because it evaluates loudness. See here, I can evaluate loudness and look at my short term. It's just another LUFS tool, basically. I have a spectrum analyzer. So like my master fader becomes analytical. We're going to talk about all of that, when we get to the sort of final steps and when we jump into Friday. So someone says, all right, is this the same process of how tracks are normalized? So no, it's not. The difference is that LUFS technology is listening into the music. It's listening into the amount of compression. It's listening into the loudness that's inherent in this digital file in the way we're now going to perceive it in the analog world or when it comes out of speakers and headphones, right? And that's a totally different process. It's actually listening into the resulting loudness of the file. It's using a digital technology to equate how we're going to hear that in the real world. Normalizing says, here's the peak of this file, let's make it to whatever number you set to normalize, bring it to 0, and this peak, bring it to 0. It doesn't take into account what's happening, the amount of squishiness, right? So normalized is this thing that was happening back I was talking about, where the TV show would play, then the commercial would be really loud, because they could still be at the same level loudness, but if one is limited more, squished more, compressed more, it's going to actually sound louder. And so that's what LUFS is able to listen into. So there's EQ curves and there's things that are going on behind the scenes that come up with those numbers. Like I said, scientists and people who study um, the ear and hearing and audio all combined to come up with this way of analyzing loudness that's very, very accurate. So it's different than the SPL analyzation of loudness. The SPL analyzation of loudness is just analyzing SPL level in the analog world. The LUFS technology is analyzing a digital file to its relevant loudness appearance in the analog world. But they work, a little differently, if that didn't confuse you anymore. But someone was saying, where does span come in with referencing? Well, I'll give you a quick little tutor on this really quickly, and that if we think about the way this process is headed, where I've got these reference tracks, the meat of the song, I've edited it down, I've level matched them to one another, I'm getting a pretty equal listening experience when I just click through them and listen to them. But what this also now does is even allow my analytical tools to be more accurate, because my tracks now have been level matched to their resulting frequency response of sort of like how they're going to be in the real world in loudness. And so I can use even spectrum analyzers more accurately. And one of the ways that I use this, if I just show you real quickly, is for me taking a look at what happens in this sub 30, 40 hertz range. It's very difficult for me to really hear that, but I can use this analytical tool with my reference tracks being level matched now and really get a sense of where that's sitting on my span and look for consistency. These are all, like this track is like 10 something years old. It's pretty thick on the low, but this is a couple weeks. Notice its similarity here around 30 hertz, 40 hertz to this one. It was like a year and a half ago, right? So I start to see some consistencies, and I can utilize these reference tracks on my analytical tools even more accurately and kind of see where things are hitting down here. And again, it gives me that sort of range so that when I'm dialing in my song, okay, so now here's the fifth one. So now the fifth one becomes really important because we see how two of them are tighter to the 30 and two of them are a little bit below the 30, and this fifth one is also tighter to the 30. So now as an analytical tool, when I'm mixing my sub in my song, if I level match that also, I can see where I might want to filter that or where I might want to level the sub. So this LUFS technology and the way of using these reference tracks really then takes my analytical tools to a whole nother level. Like I've got, I mean, I use a whole nother analytical tool for this, which is by, the Isotope people. And I'll show you a little bit about how I use that. But I basically pulled the spectrum of these 5 songs that are all level matched into another analytical tool that shows me a layout of that. And I can then see how the tracks I'm mixing plot out against these analytical tools. So it's like I'm really setting myself with this to, starting from the first thing we talked about today, which is setting my monitor level and height and distance, maybe talking about some reflections and some acoustic control, then Sonarworks to calibrate what I'm listening to, then adding reference tracks to the equation that really helps dial in that frequency target. It's like now I'm taking, all of this, with each of these little steps just get me closer and closer to achieving results that are like way beyond what I thought I could at home. And that's that's the goal, right? It's like we can achieve great results at home. We don't have to think that like, oh, well, I only have stock plugins, or I'm only working on a laptop on shitty speakers at home, or I have bad headphones. It's like we can overcome that because, um, you know, well, so the idea here is that when I first really started to use these reference tracks was when I moved from San Francisco to New York. So now I ended up in a new studio, a new room that I was basically renting studio time every week at a place. So it was, someone else's actual studio. And so they had their speakers, but it was a totally new room to me, new speakers, new environment. And so I really had to like, meanwhile, I had remixes I had to do, I had productions I had to do. I was finishing an album like right when I moved to New York. Now I'm in a whole new studio, and I was like, shit, I need to like make sure that what I'm doing and I'm making the right proper decisions, right? I want to be efficient about what I'm doing. So I had, a couple of these reference tracks have followed me for 15 years. And when I made that transition to New York, one of the first things I would do every day is I would get in and I would open up my computer, start up the whatever. I had a separate drive, but I would start up the computer and I would play the reference tracks, and that would allow me to sort of like just remember what this room is supposed to sound like. After 5 years in my own room, different speakers, different acoustics, now I would get here at this new place and start calibrate me really quickly by using these reference tracks, and that's where I really started to implement them a lot. And started to then think about, at that time I just had an iTunes playlist with a bunch of songs. And then later on, when the whole like LUFS thing came about, or initially I used RMS metering, which is still pretty accurate, but not as accurate as LUFS, which is a newer technology. But I then started to like, level match them as best as I could to then use them like I'm teaching now, right? So this idea evolved from just playing records in the studio back in the early 2000s to the mid 2000s having good digital files, and playing back in iTunes and offering me a good calibrated listening, be able to like hear and get a sense of frequencies, to then editing them down and really having them in an LUFS level matching to make them really accurate and applying them even to the tools, like I said. So I think that hopefully makes sense. So any other questions before we jump out for the day? Yeah. So there's some additional features. Um, and I'm not even, if we open this up, I think we'll see advanced metering bars, which gives us, a dark plugin theme you get on Pro. But ultimately, like the rest of it is pretty clear. So I think we get probably my estimation is on the paid version is you get 3 bars, because remember we're talking about momentary, short term, and integrated, right? So probably on the paid version, you can see those individually or whatever. Logic, Logic has a loudness meter, and it shows you 3 bars with momentary, short term, and integrated. That's just a stock plugin in Logic. There's nothing stock in Ableton. There's nothing stock in Pro Tools. But yeah, between these two, and I'm not even sure that this TB Pro. Again, the links for both of these free ones are in the notes you'll get. I don't even think this one has a paid version. They just give it away like for free. Uh, and I don't have necessarily any preference over either one of them. So if one looks better to you, works better, functions for your liking, use it. You might like this one, you might like that one. Whatever is up to you. Doesn't They're using the same technology to analyze loudness. LUFS is a standard. So one was saying, for organization workflow, do you save your chopped reference tracks for easy access, or do you start from scratch for different sounding mixes? No, I save them and I've added to them. What I've ended up with now, and we can sort of peek into this over here, is I have a really, really long one now that, my reference tracks, I sort of merged this together, but you can see how like this couple of tracks came down a little bit, this came down more, this came down less, but these are basically edited together bunches of reference tracks. This is like about 18 reference tracks. The cool thing is that this little edited file that's all -10 LUFS all the way through, this one file, I can dump this on my phone. Like I could, I use my reference tracks all the time for sound check at a club. I show up to the club and the sound guy's like, "Hey, do you want to do sound check?" And then he plays something. I'm sort of like, "Well, how is that really relevant? Like the system might sound great with that song, but if I don't like, I know what these songs are supposed to sound like. These are my personal chosen reference tracks. Some of these, as I mentioned, I've been using for 15 years from my studio in New York and beyond. So I play these. I say, "Can I play something?" And then I'll play something. And then from there, I'll know that like I know this track is supposed to be bright. If it's not bright on this sound system, then I might say, "Hey, can we boost the high end a little bit?" So again, it becomes a more relevant, idea. So yeah, I use this, over and over and over again. Now, what I do like is having, sets for different genres. Like I do a bunch of downtempo stuff. I run a downtempo label. I mix and, master that too. And so I've got a few tracks that sort of, lead me in that direction. But the majority of my work is done in house music, in tech house, and all the different names you would call it. And so I have a bunch of reference tracks that fall within that, from vocal stuff to techier stuff to heavier stuff to lighter stuff. But you know, um, it sort of gives me that guide, regardless. So, real quick, last couple questions. Do you apply the LUFS technology to the whole track, or do you use it as a reference for the individual channels as well? Yeah, I'm just doing it for my little edited bits. Um, I'm not really going to be, I'm using it to analyze this little piece of audio, this little piece of audio, like I said, and then clip ganning them to level match them. Um, it, it, the only way that I'm going to use that is I'll take it to the next step that we're going to talk about in the future, which is now how to level match these to my song, but it's the same approach, right? So let's just say this is an example of the song I'm mixing. I'm just going to bring this down a whole lot because if I'm mixing a song, it's going to have lots of headroom, right? So I can do the same thing. Here's the song I'm mixing. I look at where the LUFS is and say, okay, the song I'm mixing's LUFS is about -21.2. Now, since I've already level matched these individual regions, these are all -10, right? all I have to do now is take my fader and bring this fader down a whole bunch so that my reference tracks are also minus 21. So now I've got these little regions that were all level matched to one another. I grab whatever LUFS the track I'm working on is using my same meter, like, on the master, and then bring the fader down for the level matched reference tracks. So that's the reason that this workflow is bring them all in, edit them down, do them by clip gain to one another so that all those little pieces are level matched to one another. Because now this fader level allows me to move this around and put it wherever I want. I can copy this track and paste it into another track I'm working on, evaluate the LUFS, readjust this fader level. I know these guys are all relevant to one another. I just move them wherever I need to be and continue to use them and, as a part of my workflow. So cool. Is treating a room important for recording vocals? I sing into my Shure SM58. Yeah, but there's tools to help you kind of do that a little better. Um, I know in the back of Moon's room, she has one of those eyeball things, which basically comes around the mic and sort of helps cut out the room sound, so you get a tighter, more controlled mic sound. They also make those shields that can help. I've done it in non-treated rooms where I've set some treatment up in the corner just to sort of make it. Um, there's ways of doing that. The idea about that is to help cut down the room sound as much as you can. So uh, if you have some treatment, that can help. Whatever. So someone was saying, what is meant by the drums and bass? Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that means. I maybe said using the LUFS is not necessarily like minus 10 will work for most style of music, but maybe not for drum and bass or like dubstep, maybe is what I meant. Because dubstep is just, it's so loud that minus 10, you might have to reevaluate where you level match everything. But that could have been what I said. And then one other question. This will be the last one because we got to bounce. But do you have a template on every song with all these songs every time you work? Um, yeah, I do. I got these. Like my mastering template has my reference tracks already level matched and in there, kind of looking not so much this version, but like there's a whole bunch of little pieces like this that are in my mastering session template, and my mix session template has things that I'm using for mix on it, but also my reference tracks are in there. So yeah, you can once you get the reference track set up, you can do that and add to that and incorporate it into what you're doing. But like I said, in the initial phases, like you set this up on something you're working on, and then you want to do it on another song you've got in progress, you can quickly just copy and paste this track or import it somehow or whatever. But by copy and pasting this track, or even in Logic, copy and pasting or importing session data, like there's lots of different ways of getting tracks, literally tracks from one session to another in all the different DAWs. And the cool thing is that when you do that, it will translate and continue and keep all of this little session information data that we have. So you won't have to redo it. So by copying and pasting this track or doing import session data in Pro Tools or any of the other options, you're going to retain the work that you did and just have level match reference tracks. So there you go. Boom. Only 2 minutes overtime this time. You're all going to get the screen recording. You're going to get the notes that I worked off of so you can follow along, have this make sense. But to quick wrap up, this is our first little steps of making good quality mixes at home. A little bit of listening environment tweaking if you can. If not, some Sonarworks to help calibrate listening environments. Definitely recommend that. Now using the reference tracks to help sort of set a frequency target and, backing up and supporting the listening tweaks that we did now really sets us down the road to like really be able to utilize and implement the stuff that we're going to talk about tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and EQ and compression and all that, and make it really good for us. So cool. Okay guys, see ya. You got it. Bye.